The Battle of Sychevka unfolded within one of the most brutal and complex phases of the Eastern Front, the Rzhev-Vyazma sector in 1942. This region, stretching along the upper reaches of the Volga, became synonymous with prolonged attrition, positional warfare, and enormous casualties. While the name Rzhev would later dominate historical accounts, Sychevka was its twin, a smaller, less remembered fortress that bore the same weight of destruction and sacrifice. Situated roughly 240 kilometers west of Moscow, Sychevka served as a critical logistical hub for the German Ninth Army, commanded by Colonel General Walter Model. Its position along the railway connecting Vyazma and Rzhev made it indispensable for the Wehrmacht's defense network on the Central Front. In the aftermath of the failed German advance toward Moscow in the winter of 1941-42, the Eastern Front stabilized into a vast, frozen front line. Both sides sought to regain the initiative. The Red Army, encouraged by the partial victories of the winter counteroffensive, aimed to exploit German exhaustion and reclaim the salient bulging toward Moscow. To the Soviet High Command, the Stavka, the area around Rzhev, Vyazma, and Sychevka, represented not only a strategic threat to the capital, but also a chance to destroy one of the most powerful German field armies in the East. By early 1942, the German Ninth Army held a deeply fortified salient anchored on Sychevka, Rzhev, and Zubtsov. Despite immense losses, the Wehrmacht maintained a coherent front line with a network of trenches, strongpoints, and interlocking fields of fire. Behind the front, Sychevka functioned as a supply node, repair base, and command center. Its capture would have cut off vital transport routes and isolated German forces east of the town. For this reason, Sychevka became a central target in the Soviet Kalinin and Western Front's summer offensive, the massive Operation Same in July and August 1942, part of the wider Rzhev-Sychovka offensive. The Red Army concentrated enormous forces for the assault. Under General Georgy Zhukov's overall supervision, the Western Front fielded the 20th, 30th, 31st, and 29th Armies, supported by mechanized and tank corps. In total, approximately 650,000 men, over 1,000 tanks, and 7,000 guns and mortars were committed. Facing them, Model's Ninth Army deployed around 350,000 troops, including the 5th and 23rd Panzer Divisions, 78th Infantry Division, and multiple Luftwaffe field units. German defenses were formidable. Mine belts, anti-tank ditches, and camouflaged artillery positions, all supported by efficient logistics centered in Sychevka. The Soviet objective was clear: encircle and annihilate the Ninth Army. The plan called for a pincer movement converging on Sychevka, cutting off Rzhev to the north and Vyazma to the south. Yet the terrain posed immense challenges. Dense forests, swampy lowlands, and the summer rains turned roads into quagmires. Aerial reconnaissance was limited by poor weather, and communication between Soviet armies often broke down under German air raids. The offensive was prepared in secrecy but lacked full coordination, a recurring flaw in Red Army planning during 1942. In late July, Soviet forces began assembling along the front line, camouflaging their movements with deceptive artillery barrages and dummy positions. Civilians evacuated from the surrounding villages spoke of endless convoys of guns and fuel trucks, of railways choked with trains carrying ammunition and reserves. German aerial reconnaissance noted the buildup but underestimated its scale. Model, ever cautious, believed the Soviets might attempt a limited thrust toward Rzhev or Zubtsov, not a full-scale assault on Sychevka itself. At the same time, German morale in the sector was fragile. Soldiers who had survived the winter battles faced constant partisan attacks on supply convoys and railway lines. Reports from field units described nightly ambushes and villages cleansed by Soviet irregulars. Ammunition shortages and delayed rations were common. The German High Command still hoped to stabilize the front through disciplined defense, while the main effort in the south, towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus, consumed the Wehrmacht's offensive capacity. For the men holding the line near Sychevka, this meant enduring wave after wave of Soviet probing attacks while expecting a major assault at any moment. The balance of forces and geography gave the Soviet side an apparent advantage, yet the coming battle would reveal how deceptive such assumptions could be. The sector's terrain, narrow ridges, boggy meadows, and dense birch woods, neutralized the effectiveness of tanks and heavy artillery. Infantry assaults often bogged down within hours, while German machine gun nests and forward artillery positions could cover every possible approach. As the Soviet buildup reached its peak in late July 1942, the forests around Sychevka echoed with the rumble of engines and the clatter of tank tracks. Soldiers received final briefings and were told they would be part of the operation that would end the Rzhev front. On 30th of July, after a massive artillery preparation lasting over 2 hours, the first Soviet armies went over to the attack. It was the beginning of one of the least remembered yet most brutal offensives of the entire war, a battle that would consume entire divisions, bury tanks in marshes, and leave behind a landscape so scarred that even decades later, local farmers would still unearth shell casings and fragments of bone. The Battle of Sychevka had begun, and within days it would prove why this forgotten town became known among survivors as the other face of the Rzhev meat grinder. At dawn on 30th July 1942, the Soviet artillery barrage began with a thunderous roar that shook the ground across the entire front. Thousands of guns opened fire simultaneously, blanketing the German defenses with shells, smoke, and dust. The bombardment lasted for over 2 hours, systematically targeting trenches, command posts, and suspected artillery positions. For the soldiers of Model's Ninth Army, it was a prelude unlike anything they had yet experienced on this sector. Communications were disrupted within minutes, telephone lines shredded, and forward observation posts obliterated. When the barrage lifted, the German frontline units found themselves isolated, their defensive cohesion broken, and Soviet infantry already advancing through the haze. The 20th and 31st Armies spearheaded the assault towards Sychevka from the north and northeast. Soviet rifle divisions, supported by elements of the 8th and 9th Tank Corps, moved across open meadows and swampy ground. Within the first hours, several forward German positions were overrun. The 161st Rifle Division reported capturing the first line of trenches after heavy hand-to-hand combat, while the 9th Tank Corps penetrated nearly 2 kilometers deep before encountering concentrated German anti-tank fire. The offensive quickly lost its initial rhythm as Soviet tanks bogged down in marshy soil, their tracks choked with mud and debris. Many vehicles became immobile targets, destroyed by well-camouflaged German 88mm guns. By midday, it became evident that the artillery preparation had failed to eliminate the core of the German defensive system. The Wehrmacht's positions were constructed in depth, 3 to 4 successive lines fortified with barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and concealed strongpoints. Surviving machine gun nests opened fire as Soviet troops emerged from the morning mist, cutting down entire platoons before they could reach the next line. German field reports described the first day as an unbroken storm of infantry assaults, met by continuous waves of Soviet tanks, often burning before they reached our positions. The 78th Infantry Division, though heavily battered, held its ground at the cost of severe casualties. For the Red Army, the offensive quickly devolved into chaos. Communications between frontline units and their headquarters broke down under German counter-battery fire. Commanders on both sides relied increasingly on runners, field radios, or smoke signals. The terrain made coordinated maneuvers almost impossible. Soviet maps, based on pre-war surveys, failed to account for destroyed bridges and impassable bogs. Whole battalions lost direction, advancing into forested lowlands where German units ambushed them from both flanks. Despite this, local Soviet breakthroughs continued to occur. Small tactical successes that often came at enormous human cost. On the southern flank, the 29th Army attacked toward the railway junction linking Sychevka and Rzhev, intending to sever German supply lines. Fighting here was even more brutal. German engineers detonated charges to destroy culverts and bridges, forcing Soviet troops to wade through waist-deep water under fire. By the evening of 31st July, the offensive had gained only limited ground, between 3 and 6 kilometers in some sectors, far short of its intended encirclement objectives. Nevertheless, Soviet High Command interpreted these partial gains as signs of success and ordered the continuation of attacks without pause. German reserves were rushed in from nearby sectors. Elements of the 5th Panzer Division counterattacked from the south, striking exposed Soviet tank brigades. In one engagement near Karmanovo, 20 T-34s were destroyed within an hour, their crews trapped inside as German artillery zeroed in on the burning wrecks. The Luftwaffe, though stretched thin by commitments elsewhere, conducted continuous sorties over the battlefield, strafing Soviet columns and dropping fragmentation bombs on supply convoys. Soviet anti-aircraft units struggled to respond effectively, hampered by the difficulty of deploying their guns in swampy terrain. The town of Sychevka itself became a fortress under siege. German engineers transformed it into a defensive hub, ringed by minefields and artillery positions. Civilian inhabitants were evacuated or pressed into labor to dig trenches and carry ammunition. Field hospitals filled quickly as casualties mounted. Reports from the German Ninth Army's Medical Corps recorded over 6,000 wounded in the first 3 days of combat, while Soviet losses were far higher, estimated at 25,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Despite these losses, Soviet commanders pressed their armies forward, convinced that the German line was on the verge of collapse. Reinforcements from the 6th and 8th Tank Corps were committed on 2nd August, renewing the assault with over 200 tanks. For a brief moment, it seemed the Soviet breakthrough might succeed. Several German positions east of Sychevka were overrun, and the town's railway station came under direct artillery fire. But Model reacted swiftly. He redirected the 2nd Luftwaffe Field Division and elements of the 9th Panzer Division into the threatened sector. Within 24 hours, the Soviet spearhead was encircled and annihilated. By the first week of August, the battle around Sychevka had become a continuous storm of assaults and counter-assaults, with no decisive progress for either side. The Soviet plan of encirclement had failed to materialize. Instead, the offensive turned into a grinding war of attrition, one that would soon mirror the conditions that made the Rzhev salient infamous across both armies. Soldiers on both sides began referring to it in the same way, not as a front, but as a place where entire divisions vanished into mud, fire, and silence. By 30 August 1942, the situation at Sychevka had stabilized into a grim stalemate. Both sides were entrenched, neither able to deliver a decisive blow. For the Red Army, the offensive had already consumed vast resources. Yet Zhukov and the Stavka refused to abandon their objective. Orders were issued for renewed assaults, with the 20th and 31st Armies instructed to press forward regardless of losses. Reinforcements were arriving daily. Fresh rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments fed into the same narrow front. The result was not momentum, but congestion. Roads behind the Soviet lines were jammed with supply convoys, wounded columns, and retreating stragglers. The muddy terrain absorbed everything: men, machines, and blood. German forces, though battered, retained cohesion. Model's defensive doctrine relied on elastic counterattacks, letting Soviet troops advance into forward zones before striking with concentrated artillery and local reserves. This approach proved devastating. Each Soviet advance was followed by envelopment fire, cutting off exposed units from their rear. Soviet infantry found themselves isolated, pinned in shallow trenches, and destroyed piecemeal. German field batteries, positioned along the ridges east of Sychevka, fired continuously, their barrages timed to coincide with Soviet regrouping attempts. The air over the battlefield was a haze of cordite and smoke, the horizon constantly flickering with flashes of explosions. The fighting on 4 and 5 August was especially fierce. The 9th Guards Rifle Division and the 8th Tank Corps attempted to flank the German strongpoints around the village of Karmanovo, seeking to reach the Sychevka-Rzhev railway. The attack began before dawn, with artillery support from over 500 guns. Initial gains were promising. Soviet units captured several forward bunkers and advanced nearly 4 kilometers before encountering a line of concealed anti-tank positions. Within minutes, dozens of T-34s and KV-1s were hit and set ablaze. Survivors tried to bypass the obstacle, only to encounter minefields and pre-sighted mortar fire. German infantry from the 256th Division counterattacked with grenades and flamethrowers, driving the Soviets back in brutal close combat. The battlefield was left covered with destroyed tanks, broken equipment, and the bodies of men from both armies. The attritional character of the battle became evident. Neither side could maneuver effectively. Instead, they clashed repeatedly over the same few square kilometers of ruined ground. Forests were stripped bare by shellfire, villages reduced to smoking craters. In this environment, survival depended as much on endurance as on tactics. Reports from the Soviet 30th Army described entire regiments reduced to a few dozen survivors after just days of fighting. Commanders frequently lost contact with their companies, while medical units were overwhelmed by the scale of casualties. In some sectors, soldiers fought continuously for 72 hours without relief, subsisting on cold rations and melted rainwater. German units fared little better. The 9th Army's logistic lines were stretched to breaking point. Ammunition supplies were dangerously low, and the shortage of replacement vehicles made evacuation of the wounded nearly impossible. Field hospitals in Sychevka and Rzhev overflowed. Luftwaffe transports attempted to airlift supplies, but Soviet anti-aircraft fire and constant bad weather limited their effectiveness. German after-action reports from the 5th Panzer Division mentioned exhaustion beyond endurance among crews who had been in combat without rest since the start of the Soviet offensive. Yet despite these conditions, Model's command system held. Every local crisis was met with rapid reorganization, and every Soviet penetration was methodically sealed off by counterattacks. The turning of the weather compounded the misery. Heavy rain turned the battlefield into a morass of mud and standing water. Vehicles sank axle deep, and movement of artillery became nearly impossible. Horses and men collapsed from exhaustion, yet the orders from above did not change. Zhukov, determined to break the Rzhev-Sychevka line before autumn, demanded renewed assaults. On 6 August, a massive Soviet bombardment opened once again, targeting the German lines northwest of Sychevka. The 6th and 8th Tank Corps led the charge, supported by infantry from the 247th and 348th Rifle Divisions. For several hours, the Soviet advance appeared unstoppable. German communications collapsed, and Model's forward units reported that Soviet troops had reached within 10 kilometers of the town. However, as had happened many times before, the initial success quickly turned into disaster. The Soviet armored spearhead, advancing too far ahead of its infantry support, was ambushed by German tanks and anti-tank guns hidden in forested ridges near Novaya. The 23rd Panzer Division launched a counterstrike from the south, cutting off 2 Soviet brigades and encircling them by nightfall. Attempts to break through failed, and by the following morning, the surrounded Soviet units were annihilated. Survivors described it as a massacre conducted in silence, the guns drowned by the sound of rain and the mud swallowing the wounded. As casualties mounted, both armies resorted increasingly to improvised methods of warfare. Soviet soldiers used captured Panzerfausts and grenades scavenged from the dead. Germans, short of ammunition, relied on bayonet charges and close-range fire. The battlefield had no clear front line anymore, just zones of destruction where men crawled through craters and corpses, fighting over ground that had already been taken and lost dozens of times. By 10 August, it was clear that the Sychevka offensive had failed to achieve its strategic goal. The German line, though deeply scarred, still held firm. Zhukov's attempts to outflank the town from the north had stalled, and his armies had lost nearly 100,000 men in less than 2 weeks. The Soviet command shifted its attention to secondary sectors, ordering diversionary attacks toward Zubtsov and Olenino. Yet the fighting around Sychevka continued, not as part of any coherent plan, but as a momentum of destruction that neither side could stop. German intelligence, analyzing intercepted Soviet communications, concluded that the Red Army's offensive strength was exhausted but not broken. The Ninth Army's situation, though precarious, was judged sustainable if reinforcements could arrive. But the scale of losses was undeniable. Model's divisions had been reduced to skeleton formations. The 78th Infantry Division, once numbering over 15,000 men, now counted fewer than 4,000 combat-effective soldiers. Entire companies were led by sergeants after officers were killed or incapacitated. The Wehrmacht had survived another crisis, but the price was high, and the Soviet command had not yet accepted defeat. In Moscow, the Stavka considered the first phase of the Sychevka offensive complete, even as reports from the front told a different story. Zhukov requested reinforcements to continue the pressure, insisting that the German Ninth Army was nearing collapse. Orders were given to regroup, replenish, and resume the assault within days. The other face of the Rzhev meat grinder was far from over. It was only deepening. By mid-August 1942, the Battle of Sychevka had become a symbol of the Red Army's determination and suffering. The first phase of the offensive had failed to break the German defenses, yet the Stavka ordered Zhukov to continue the assault. His mission remained unchanged: to destroy the German Ninth Army and collapse the entire Rzhev salient. Reinforcements arrived from the Kalinin and Western fronts. Fresh rifle divisions, artillery regiments, and tank brigades replenished with newly manufactured T-34s and KV-1s from Moscow and Gorky factories. These new forces were immediately thrown into the battle, often without adequate reconnaissance or rest. For thousands of Soviet soldiers, the train journey westward was the last they would ever make. The second phase of the offensive began on 15th of August with another massive artillery preparation. More than 8,000 guns and mortars lined the front between Zubtsov and Sychevka. The ground shook for hours as shells pounded German lines. Soviet gunners were instructed to fire until the barrels overheated. The barrage obliterated forest cover and smashed forward trenches, but the depth of the German defenses meant that the core positions survived. When Soviet infantry advanced, they encountered minefields, concealed bunkers, and overlapping machine gun fire. German forward observers, positioned on higher ground near Sychevka's railway embankment, directed precise artillery fire that shredded advancing Soviet formations. The renewed Soviet assault was spearheaded by the 20th and 31st Armies, with the 6th and 8th Tank Corps in support. Their objective was to encircle Sychevka from both flanks, cutting off the German garrison and collapsing the defensive pocket. The 9th Guards Rifle Division advanced through a belt of woods north of the town, while the 8th Tank Corps moved along the main road toward the Volga River crossings. Initial progress was encouraging. The Soviets broke through several German outposts and captured key villages, including Bolshoye Kropatovo and Maloye Nikotino. But resistance stiffened as the 23rd Panzer Division counterattacked from the south, halting the Soviet advance and trapping several battalions in low-lying marshes. German defenses around Sychevka had been transformed into a layered fortress. Model had ordered the construction of concentric defensive rings, each one anchored by strongpoints manned by mixed formations of infantry, engineers, and Luftwaffe field troops. Artillery batteries were hidden within tree lines protected by reinforced bunkers. Anti-tank ditches, flooded fields, and barbed wire slowed Soviet movements to a crawl. Whenever a Soviet unit broke through, German engineers detonated demolitions behind them, cutting off retreat and isolating entire brigades. Captured Soviet maps later revealed that the Red Army had severely underestimated the density and complexity of these defenses. For both sides, the fighting took on an increasingly inhuman character. The front was a landscape of mud, water, and wreckage. Forests were reduced to skeletal remains of trees, and streams ran red with silt and blood. Soviet medics worked around the clock in makeshift field hospitals, often without morphine or medical supplies. Many wounded lay for days in craters or trenches, unable to be evacuated. German field hospitals faced similar crises: overcrowded, undersupplied, and constantly targeted by Soviet artillery. Reports from the 78th Infantry Division recorded over 400 cases of trench foot and frostbite even before autumn arrived. caused by soldiers standing for hours in waterlogged trenches. The Luftwaffe regained partial control of the air during this phase, conducting up to 500 sorties daily. Juncker's Ju-87 dive bombers attacked Soviet tank concentrations and artillery positions, forcing Soviet troops to disperse. In response, Soviet Yak and Lei-GG fighters attempted to intercept, but airfields near Rzhev and Vyazma were frequently bombed, limiting their operational capacity. The Soviets relied increasingly on night bombing raids using Pe-2 and Il-4 bombers, but navigation errors and poor coordination often led to bombs falling on friendly positions. Both sides suffered from the unpredictable weather. Sudden storms grounded aircraft and flooded supply routes, creating chaos in logistics. By the third week of August, the Soviet advance had slowed to a crawl. Divisions that began the offensive with 10,000 men were reduced to half that number. Tank Corps reported catastrophic losses. The 6th Tank Corps had fewer than 40 operational tanks, while the 8th had under 60. German reports estimated that Soviet forces had lost nearly 2,500 tanks in the Rzhev-Sychevka sector by late August, though Soviet archives later revised the figure slightly lower. Still, the losses were enormous. Zhukov's armies were consuming men and material faster than they could be replaced. Yet the Soviet High Command was unwilling to accept failure. Stalin, impatient for victory, sent direct orders demanding continued attacks. He warned Zhukov against halting the offensive, accusing commanders of lacking determination. The Soviet generals on the ground, Kurochkin, Maslenikov, and Boldin, argued for a pause to regroup, but their appeals were denied. The attacks resumed with diminished strength, often conducted by exhausted troops with little ammunition. Assaults were carried out at dawn, dusk, or even at night under flares, when exhausted soldiers stumbled through smoke and shell fire, unable to distinguish friend from foe. The town of Sychevka itself became a place of horror. Once a modest provincial town, it was now a ruin of blackened walls and craters. The German garrison held on, supplied by night convoys and occasional airdrops. Streets were barricaded with sandbags and wrecked vehicles, machine guns mounted in church towers and basements. Soviet artillery bombarded the town daily, reducing it to rubble. Civilians who had failed to evacuate were trapped in cellars, surviving on rainwater and the remains of livestock. German medical units operated in the basements of destroyed houses, while the dead were buried in shallow graves under the rubble. On 20th August, a new Soviet assault briefly broke into the outskirts of the town. Elements of the 31st Army captured the northern suburbs before being driven back by German counterattacks. The fighting in the streets was close and desperate. Grenades, bayonets, and flamethrowers deciding control of each block. Both sides suffered heavy losses, but neither could sustain the tempo. The Soviets withdrew to the edge of the town, regrouping under constant shell fire. The Germans held their lines, but their strength was ebbing. By the end of August, the front around Sychevka had barely moved. What began as a grand encirclement operation had devolved into an attritional struggle of annihilation. Soviet records show that by 25 August, combined casualties of the Western and Kalinin fronts exceeded 250,000 men. German losses, though smaller, were also severe. Approximately 40,000 killed, wounded, or missing. The fields around Sychevka were strewn with thousands of unburied bodies, the air thick with the stench of decay. The offensive was not yet over, but its momentum was gone. Zhukov's forces had spent themselves in repeated frontal assaults, while Model's Ninth Army clung to its positions with what remained of its divisions. Both armies were trapped in a mutual stalemate that neither could escape, and as August turned to September, the battle's character shifted once again, from one of movement and attack to one of slow suffocation, where soldiers fought not for victory, but simply to survive another day in the infernal landscape around Sychevka. By early September 1942, the Sychevka front had become a landscape of exhaustion and ruin. The Red Army's summer offensive was entering its third month, but the promise of breakthrough had long faded. What remained was a grim war of endurance. Soviet forces continued to attack daily, often without clear objectives beyond maintaining pressure. Commanders rotated divisions through the front line, but the replacements were no longer fresh. Most were newly mobilized recruits, poorly trained and unfamiliar with the terrain. For many of them, their first day at the front was also their last. The Soviet High Command still viewed Sychevka as a key to collapsing the German Ninth Army's defensive network. If the town could be taken, the entire Zhev salient might be forced into retreat. Yet reality on the ground told another story. The 20th, 30th, and 31st Armies were depleted, their ranks filled with men suffering from exhaustion, malnutrition, and untreated wounds. Supply shortages worsened as autumn rains returned, turning the roads into impassable rivers of mud. Fuel for tanks and trucks was rationed, food arrived spoiled or not at all, and field kitchens were constantly shelled. Soviet war correspondents who visited the sector described endless lines of wounded being carried to the rear, the sound of artillery never ceasing even for an hour. The Germans, too, were nearing their breaking point. Model's Ninth Army had suffered catastrophic losses since July. Entire battalions existed only on paper. The 78th and 256th Infantry Divisions were down to a third of their original strength. Artillery shells were rationed to a handful per gun per day, and machine gun barrels were worn smooth from overuse. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, could no longer provide consistent air cover. Many airfields had been rendered unusable by Soviet bombers or weather conditions. German soldiers lived in flooded trenches, surrounded by mud and corpses, tormented by lice and dysentery. Even Model, known for his stoicism, admitted privately to his staff that the situation resembled a slow-motion collapse. Despite this, the German defensive machine continued to function. Every Soviet advance met precise and disciplined counterfire. The defenders used mobile reserves to plug gaps, striking back whenever the Red Army appeared weakest. Model's mastery of flexible defense allowed him to hold territory with minimal resources, trading space for time when necessary. He relied heavily on rapid communication and centralized artillery control, coordinating fire from multiple batteries onto advancing Soviet units. This tactical efficiency was decisive. It transformed what might have been a retreat into a stubborn stand that cost the Red Army tens of thousands of lives. The Soviet offensives in early September focused on the northern flank of the Sychevka salient, near the villages of Karmanovo and Novoye. Here, the 31st and 20th Armies attempted to outflank the German defenses and sever the road to Rzhev. The attacks began under heavy rain and fog, with artillery barrages that lasted through the night. Soviet tanks, advancing through marshy terrain, became bogged down or stuck in craters created by previous shelling. Infantry followed on foot, often wading waist-deep in mud. German forward observers, despite limited visibility, directed mortar and artillery fire with deadly accuracy. The Soviet 9th Guards Rifle Division lost nearly half its strength in 2 days. One Soviet after-action report captured the grim reality. The wounded cannot be evacuated. They drown in the swamps or freeze at night. Horses collapse from exhaustion. Men sleep standing up, leaning on rifles. The earth is soaked with blood and rainwater. Even as reports like this reached Moscow, Zhukov continued to order attacks. Stalin's directives demanded constant offensive activity to prevent the Germans from transferring forces southward to Stalingrad. In effect, the soldiers at Sychevka were fighting a diversionary battle on behalf of other fronts, a fact known to few of them. German intelligence recognized this shift. Model's staff noted that Soviet attacks had become less coordinated, suggesting exhaustion rather than renewed strategic intent. Nevertheless, the fighting did not stop. On 10th of September, a major Soviet assault involving the 8th Tank Corps and the 247th Rifle Division struck the German line near the village of Lazevo. After fierce combat, Soviet forces managed to capture the first line of trenches, but were soon encircled by counterattacks from the 5th Panzer Division. The encirclement was swift and devastating. Cut off from reinforcements, the Soviets fought for 2 days before being annihilated. German reports counted more than 1,000 prisoners and dozens of destroyed tanks left behind in the mud. As the front stagnated, partisans intensified their activity in the rear. Soviet guerrilla units operating behind the German lines disrupted supply routes and ambushed convoys moving between Vyazma and Sychevka. These operations, though limited in scale, had a cumulative effect. Fuel shortages worsened and ammunition deliveries became unpredictable. German garrisons in small villages were forced to divert manpower to anti-partisan duties, further thinning their already overstretched lines. The local civilian population, trapped between the two sides, suffered terribly. Entire villages were burned during reprisal operations. Civilians were deported for labor or executed for aiding the partisans. For the people of the Smolensk region, The front brought only hunger, disease, and by mid-September, the Soviet command finally acknowledged that the offensive was unsustainable. Reports from the front estimated total losses at more than 300,000 men, including over 100,000 killed or missing. Equipment losses were staggering: over 2,000 tanks and 5,000 guns and mortars destroyed or abandoned. But despite this, Sychevka still stood. The German Ninth Army remained entrenched, bloodied but unbroken. Zhukov requested permission to halt the operation and reorganize his forces for a new plan, but Stalin's response was uncompromising. The order from the Stavka read simply, "Continue the offensive. The enemy is weakened. Victory is near." The following week, Soviet forces renewed their assaults once more. This time, however, the attacks were smaller, localized, and desperate. Instead of coordinated offensives, isolated regiments advanced on narrow fronts, supported by minimal artillery. Some units were composed of remnants from multiple divisions combined under temporary command. The fighting resembled a slow grind rather than a battle. Soldiers crawled through mud, throwing grenades into bunkers, only to be cut down by return fire. German artillery systematically destroyed concentrations of Soviet troops before they could assemble for another charge. By the third week of September, the Soviet attacks had lost all momentum. Even the most hardened commanders realized the futility of continuing. Ammunition stocks were depleted, tank reserves were exhausted, and the morale of the troops had collapsed. In one recorded case, the 348th Rifle Division refused to advance after losing 3 successive commanders within 2 days. Political officers reported widespread signs of fatigue, mental breakdowns, and indifference to orders. Still, discipline remained harsh. Retreat without orders meant immediate execution. The Sychevka front was now little more than a graveyard of armies. The Soviet attempt to crush Model's Ninth Army had failed, and the Red Army's enormous losses were beginning to affect its operations across the entire Western Front. But for the men still fighting amid the swamps and forests, there was no sense of strategic failure or success, only survival. The offensive that began with ambition to destroy a German army had devolved into the same nightmare of attrition that had come to define Rzhev: endless death over ground that mattered little, fought in conditions that erased all distinction between victory and defeat. By late September 1942, the once grand Soviet offensive toward Sychevka had dissolved into isolated battles fought over ruined fields and shattered villages. The 20th and 31st Armies, once numbering hundreds of thousands of men, now operated as hollow shells of their original strength. Entire divisions existed only on paper, and regimental commanders led remnants of units that bore no resemblance to the forces that had begun the campaign in July. The battlefield had become static, a zone of death where movement brought almost certain annihilation. Soldiers dug deeper into the earth, carving trenches into the wet soil, building shelters from logs and debris, and living in conditions more akin to survival than warfare. The German Ninth Army, equally battered, was in no better condition. Model's troops had held their ground, but at the cost of exhaustion and near starvation. Supply columns could barely reach the front through the mire of destroyed roads. Trucks sank into the mud, horses collapsed, and many convoys never arrived. Ammunition was so scarce that German artillery was forced to restrict fire to verified targets only. Soldiers subsisted on reduced rations of bread and dried meat. The once disciplined Wehrmacht units were now gaunt, filthy, and demoralized. Yet the line held, a testament to the rigidity of German command structure and the soldiers' belief that retreat meant encirclement and death. The Soviet command still refused to declare the offensive over. In Moscow, political leaders viewed the stalemate as temporary and insisted that one final effort might break the German defense. Orders from the Stavka in early October directed Zhukov to launch a renewed attack, this time focusing on the southern approaches to Sychevka. Reinforcements arrived in the form of 2 understrength rifle divisions and elements of the 1st Mechanized Corps, but they were poorly equipped and barely rested. Many of the men lacked proper uniforms or winter clothing as the first frosts began to coat the ground. Even the newly arrived tanks, shipped directly from factories, suffered mechanical failures in the thick mud and freezing temperatures. The attack began on 7th of October, preceded by a brief artillery barrage. It was a pale shadow of the massive bombardments of August. Many guns lacked ammunition, and Soviet commanders could only fire short, concentrated salvos before sending infantry forward. The Germans, expecting the assault, responded with pre-registered artillery fire. Shells exploded among the advancing Soviet troops, tearing gaps in their formations before they could even reach the front lines. Survivors pressed on through fog and smoke, often stumbling into minefields or barbed wire. In several sectors, Soviet battalions were wiped out within minutes. The 31st Army managed to gain a small foothold near the village of Tatishchevo, capturing a few German trenches after savage hand-to-hand fighting. However, counterattacks by the 23rd Panzer Division quickly encircled the position. German tanks, advancing through the fog, crushed Soviet defenses one by one. Only a few hundred men managed to retreat. The rest were killed or captured. Prisoners taken by the Germans spoke of hunger, disorganization, and despair. One German report recorded that many Soviet soldiers carried no weapons. They had been sent forward unarmed, told to take rifles from the fallen. The weather now became the greatest enemy of both sides. By mid-October, the front had turned into a sea of mud. Rain and sleet fell daily. Roads vanished, supply wagons overturned, and field kitchens sank into the muck. The temperature dropped sharply at night, freezing the waterlogged earth and trapping vehicles in ice. Soldiers fought not for ground, but for shelter and warmth. German positions were reinforced with captured Soviet logs and planks, creating makeshift bunkers filled with smoke from wet firewood. On the Soviet side, trench lines flooded to waist height. Men dug holes in the embankments to sleep, covering themselves with tarps or discarded coats. Frostbite and disease spread rapidly. Dysentery, pneumonia, and trench fever claimed more lives than enemy fire. In these conditions, organized combat was nearly impossible. Instead, both sides resorted to small-scale raids, reconnaissance skirmishes, and artillery duels. Night fighting became common as soldiers sought to ambush patrols or steal supplies from abandoned positions. The front took on a surreal quality. Flashes of gunfire in the fog, the echo of machine guns across the flooded fields, and the cries of wounded men lost between the lines. German and Soviet soldiers sometimes occupied opposing sides of the same ruined village, separated only by a single street, exchanging grenades and rifle fire without ever seeing each other clearly. The human cost of the Sychevka sector was staggering. By mid-October, Soviet losses exceeded 350,000 men since the start of the operation, including killed, wounded, and missing. German casualties were estimated at 70,000, though precise figures were impossible to verify. The ground was littered with corpses frozen in unnatural poses, tanks half buried in mud, and shattered artillery pieces protruding from the soil like broken bones. Local civilians who had survived the bombardment scavenged the ruins for food and firewood, living among the dead. Their villages had ceased to exist, entire communities erased from the map. Despite the horror, the war machine ground on. German engineers worked tirelessly to repair defensive positions before the onset of winter. Field railways were constructed to bring ammunition and rations from Vyazma, while Soviet engineers built new corduroy roads from logs to maintain supply routes through the marshes. Every movement was accompanied by loss. Bridges collapsed, convoys were shelled, and partisans attacked both sides indiscriminately. The front near Sychevka no longer resembled a battle, but a vast industrial process of death, a system that consumed men and material in equal measure. By late October, the Soviet offensive had effectively ended, though no formal order declared it so. The armies of Zhukov's Western Front were withdrawn one by one to refit and rest. In their place, smaller formations were left to hold the line. The Germans, though victorious in defense, could not pursue. They were trapped within their own success, tied to the same positions that had cost them so much to hold. Both sides knew that the battle was not truly finished, that it would resume again when conditions allowed. The land around Sychevka was silent now, but beneath the frost and mud lay the remnants of hundreds of thousands of men, the ghosts of an operation whose purpose had long since been forgotten. In the official communiqué, both sides claimed success. The Soviet press spoke of local advances and enemy losses, while the German bulletins reported repelled attacks and stabilized positions. In truth, neither had won. The Battle of Sychevka was a stalemate, one that drained strength from both armies and achieved nothing of strategic value. Yet it had revealed something fundamental about the nature of the war on the Eastern Front. That victory was measured not in kilometers gained but in endurance, and that survival itself had become the only triumph possible in a battlefield that devoured all who entered it. As November 1942 began, The battlefield around Sychevka entered a period of uneasy quiet. The guns still fired daily, but the thunder of large offensives was gone. Both sides were locked in positions that had scarcely shifted since summer. The once lush fields had frozen solid, preserving the wreckage of tanks, trucks, and bodies beneath a thin layer of snow. Frost covered the twisted remains of villages, the shattered church domes, and the skeletal trees that lined the Nara and Vazuza river valleys. The soldiers on both sides no longer spoke of victory, only of survival through the winter. The German Ninth Army dug deeper into its defensive lines. Model's engineers reinforced trenches with logs and steel sheets taken from destroyed buildings. Mines were laid in vast belts, often frozen into the soil, while barbed wire was strung between burned-out tanks. Supply trains from Vyazma brought coal, ammunition, and limited rations, but shortages were constant. Soldiers were ordered to salvage winter clothing from the dead, while makeshift stoves were built from shell casings. Frostbite became as deadly as Soviet artillery. Medical officers reported that in some units, 1 out of every 5 soldiers was unfit for duty due to exposure. The Soviet side was equally battered. Zhukov's armies, now reconstituting after the failed summer offensive, held a thin front line facing Sychevka and Rzhev. The men lived in dugouts carved into frozen earth, heating themselves with smoldering logs. Supplies were minimal. Boots, gloves, and food were scarce. Rations consisted mostly of bread and frozen potatoes. Morale fluctuated between grim determination and silent resignation. Commissars gave speeches about the inevitability of victory, but few believed them. Soldiers spoke instead about the fallen, the missing, and the long columns of wounded who had vanished into the rear months earlier. Despite exhaustion, the Red Army continued to probe German defenses with local attacks. These operations were small, a few companies at a time, but relentless. Night raids, reconnaissance patrols, and mortar bombardments kept the front in a state of tension. Soviet snipers hunted along the frozen riverbanks, while German scouts infiltrated Soviet lines to capture prisoners for interrogation. In the gray light of early morning, the silence was often broken by brief bursts of gunfire, followed by screams quickly swallowed by the wind. The Luftwaffe had largely withdrawn from the sector by this point, redeployed to support operations at Stalingrad and the Caucasus. This gave the Red Army limited control of the air. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft flew freely over the battlefield, photographing German trenches and logistics routes. Yet even with this advantage, no major offensive was possible. The roads were impassable, rivers frozen, and reserves too depleted. The front near Sychevka became a place of waiting, both armies immobilized, conserving strength for future campaigns. The civilians who remained in the area endured conditions that defied comprehension. Villages destroyed during the summer were never rebuilt. Those who had survived bombardments lived in holes dug into hillsides or in the basements of burned-out houses. Food came from scavenging, frozen grain, dead livestock, or supplies stolen from army dumps. Disease spread rapidly among the displaced. German occupation authorities attempted to maintain order through harsh measures, executing suspected partisans and deporting able-bodied men to labor camps. Soviet partisans, operating in the forests around the town, retaliated by ambushing German convoys and destroying railway lines. The war had reduced civilian life to a struggle for existence between two hostile forces that seemed indifferent to the suffering around them.